would like to introduce Dr. Sally Goerner she is the science advisor for the Capital Institute, and she is an authority on nonlinear dynamics, a psychologist and an engineer, and a very broad thinker. She has been doing research and a lot of writing on energy flow networks from her studies in ecology and social organization. She is going to share some of her work around regenerative development and the art and science of creating durable, vibrant human networks. Also on stage is Brian Fath, who is waiting to be mic'd up, but it will soon be mic'd. He's a research scholar at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis and editor-in-chief of a journal of ecological modeling. He is doing research now on what some of you might know, the work of Robert Ulanowitz on resilience and efficiency in ecosystems and the window of viability. So I welcome Sally to the stage. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, so we had some very interesting conversations over lunch, so I'm going to start with those, just like Dr. Sharma did. I think the best way to understand me is that I really do have a foot in both sides. I'm an engineer, I'm basically a systems physicist, and I'm very big on rigor and measurability and methods and all those kinds of things. And I'm a psychologist, and I've been a student of social evolution and great change for 25 years now. And my mission in life is to show that it's possible to bridge those two, because in fact, there's a new systemic way of dealing with systems in physics and mathematics that's going to make it a much more compatible system with everything you already know about sociology, anthropology, growth, development, all those kinds of things. And so my simple but impossible task is to give you the hope that it's possible to actually know what will make a system healthy, how to measure whether or not your system is getting healthier or getting sicker. Okay, so I'll go through what is regenerative development. By the way, there's this terrible language problem. When I originally started on this work, I talked about the fact that science was undergoing a significant great change thanks to the fact that now we have computers. We can actually study and understand the patterns that whole systems make. And so every field of science, whether it's medicine or whether it's urban planning or you name it, every field in science now has a significant way of dealing with their phenomenon as a system and as a whole system and understanding the patterns and principles that make systems healthy, okay? I call that the switch from modern science to integral science, with integral being the idea that things are whole, and understanding how things work together is what's going to make us really burst forth to a new level of understanding and development. But unfortunately, that term got taken over by various other people, and so if I use the term integral anymore, now people think I'm doing Ken Wilber's work, which I'm not. We also struggle with, so what do you call this science? I'm now calling it energy flow science because that's convenient, and that is actually the physical basis of all of this. But it's very much also what you will understand as biomimicry. So regenerative development can be most easily understood as we're going to apply the same rules that nature or the cosmos uses to build durably vibrant systems, and we're going to apply them to human systems as well, okay? What we're going to do is we're then going to use the physical sciences of flow systems to make that idea precise in a way that's not abusive and oppressive. So it's not like we're going to take human systems and cram them down into a little simplistic, narrow little box and try to measure things. No, we're just going to show you how you can measure the patterns that you already see, okay? And among the more interesting aspects of this is that understanding how flow systems works is going to help you reconnect a lot of the moral values and the cultural understandings and the wisdom traditions to understanding of healthy economic functioning. And then last but not least, the really amazing possibility is that there are going to be precise measures of systemic health and vitality that are going to make complete common sense and not make you feel like you are doing damage to the system under study. Okay, so flow systems are holistic, humanistic, rigorous, and universal all at the same time. What? Oh, should I talk into this? I'm not really on. Oh, well. All right, I'll stand over here. And the rigorous and universal part comes from the study of energy flow. So if you're a physicist, you believe that energy is basically the driving force behind all movement, growth, development, and evolution. I mean, that's why it appears in everything. And we even sort of have a tacit understanding of that in the social sciences. So we say, well, pressure is building over there, or you know, you really need some energy, put some energy into the system. All of those things may turn out to be more literally true than we currently imagine. And the other interesting thing is that in physics, you can translate energy into information, because information in physics terms is really just a fine-grained energy trail, like a photon of light that we end up using as sight, or a chemical gradient that we end up using as smell, or sensing as smell. So that the other thing about energy is that it explains both the physical changes and the structural changes in things, and why things move and grow and develop. And it also explains why information and eventually intelligence and consciousness are all natural parts of the evolution of these systems. Okay, so but for the physics part of it, what they're going to what understanding these flow networks are going to do is identify the key factors behind regenerative vitality, address root causes as opposed to just symptoms rather, and to provide quantitative measures and targets for systemic health. So the holistic humanistic part comes from the fact that if you think about a system, systems are always built of previously independent parts that somehow come together in a new whole system that works together. So the parts always work together. That's true whether whether a tornado rises up and gets all these little molecules to move in a nice little concentric circle to move energy faster, or whether it's metabolism in your body where you've got all of these cells that are processing different parts and moving resources and processing energy and making sure that the whole stays healthy, or in an economy. So once you understand that systems are always built of smaller parts that must cooperate together for their individual health and the health of the whole, then you understand why in human systems we discover the importance of things like reciprocity and synergy. I've listed Ruth Benedict, who, if you don't know, was an anthropologist contemporary of Margaret Mead, and who has done a whole study of the synergy gamut and studying how cultures that focus more on synergy and tend to be happier, healthier, more productive, and have very little of the misery index, no crime, no suicide or homicide and those kinds of things, whereas those that are primarily focused on ego and self and greed and basically out for themselves are characterized by all the things that we see in modern society, lots of violence, lots of drug abuse, lots of suicide, and generally behaving in ways that are not good for the health of the whole. So understanding things as systems, even as flow systems, helps you understand why we have evolved these kinds of cultural things over long periods of time. The advantage of understanding the physics of flow systems is that you can understand many of the things that we already understand. For instance, flow systems do best when there's a lot of tight energy circulation inside the system. So as opposed to having wealth concentrated on the top and very little trickling down to any place else, if you want to have a vibrant system, you better have a lot of energy and resources and information circulating to all those grassroots lower levels and middle levels of the society. So you can actually judge the health of a system by how much energy is flowing internally. There's the the economic measure is usually called the multiplier effect, which is how many times money changes hands within the system before it goes out. And the opposite end of the spectrum are what they call through flow economies. So if you imagine an Appalachian coal town, they have very little money is circulating internally, and most of it is just being, resources are extracted and the wealth is flowing off someplace else. So they don't pump any money back into building the internal capacities and infrastructure. So these kinds of basic understandings help us see that there are certain key, simple principles of what makes a flow network healthy. First is circulate thoroughly. You have to get energy and resources and information throughout all parts of the whole in order to keep all parts of the whole healthy. You need to have all parts healthy because we all depend on various specialties to keep the whole system running. You also have to reinvest vigorously. So in stark contrast to the concept of austerity, you better be spending a lot of money on education, on roads, on healthcare, on all the kinds of things that go into having a healthy common cause infrastructure. You have to ensure reliable inputs and have healthy outputs, which is the basic message of sustainability. So for instance, if you know that you're going to run out of fossil fuels very shortly, you better start finding an alternative that's not going to do you in, okay? The last one is probably the most unexpected, and that is maintain balance. Now, balance comes from the way that systems organize themselves to be healthy over long periods of time. So that, you ever notice that all sorts of systems have this sort of hierarchical branching patterns? So you see them in lungs where there are many small, more diverse, more resilient aspects at the lower levels of the structure, and as you go higher, there's fewer, they're less diverse, and they're more efficient until you get to the very top, and the highest level of the system will tend to have very few, very large, very efficient, high-capacity elements on top. And that's true whether you're doing a banking system, a circulatory system, or an ecosystem. Now, the advantage of the math is that you can actually measure whether or not there's a sufficient balance of small, medium, and large at every scale. So just as in an ecosystem, if you have too many small guys and not enough big guys, the small guys will gobble up everything and the ecosystem will collapse. Or if the big guys are gobbling up too much, they will eat up all the prey and then the ecosystem will collapse. You have to maintain a balance of every scale in order to keep the system healthy. Okay, so Paul was mentioning the concept of the window of vitality, which is if you look at ecosystems, they maintain a balance of small-scale diversity and large-scale efficiency. So they will have a few large predators, and they will have lots of varying degrees of small, whether it's fish or what have you. The same kind of, okay, this applies to balancing resilience and efficiency, because if efficiency is based on streamlining and high capacity. So when companies merge and they talk about economies of scale, they're talking about where we're going to eliminate a lot of redundancy, we're going to get rid of people, we're going to have just strict flow, fast flow, high volume, high capacity. Whereas resilience increases with diversity, small scale, and flexibility. So these two equally necessary phenomena or characteristics of the system actually pull in opposite directions. So if you want to have a healthy system, you have to have a good balance of big and little, of efficiency and resilience, because you need both characteristics. And this, of course, is originally by Bob Alanowitz. All right, the other implication of this kind of optimal structure is that it optimizes circulation across scales, because you need the big guys to move energy, or in this case money, in a banking system from one side to the other, one part of the globe to another. In large volumes, you need a big bank to do that. At the same time, when you also need little banks at local places who know the markets and who are able to hand out loans that make sense because they know whether or not they're going to get repaid, and they're invested in the health of the community. Okay, so what happens is, just as you need wetlands to perform certain services that a big conduit cannot, so in banking systems, you need small-scale banks that are appropriate to meet the needs of individuals at that scale, and you need medium and large-scale ones to appropriately meet the needs at different scales of the overall system. So we call that the Goldilocks rule, because you have to have organizations that are just right for each scale. What happens if you have an imbalance is much like what happens in an ecosystem. So if you have, as we did recently, the big banks gobbling up all the little banks such that the only banks that are left at the local scales are really ATMs for the big banks someplace else, then what you will have is very few loans being allocated at this grassroots level because it's uneconomic for a big bank to put in small-scale loans, and they won't have anybody who really knows the market there or have anybody who's invested in the local market. So what happens over time is you get this gigantic vortex of wealth being pulled from the grassroots, going to the top and not circulating back down, and that kills off large swaths of economic tissue. So we call it economic necrosis. And an indication of economic necrosis is concentration of wealth on top and growing poverty elimination of the middle class and growing poverty at the bottom. And also low birth rate of new businesses, especially at the small scale. Okay, so that's what I forgot I had one of those. So the other thing you can do with flow systems, as this last example sort of suggests, is you can use it to differentiate between two types of economies. Regenerative ones, which circulate robustly, reinvest generously, maintain a balance of small, medium, and large, and maintain healthy inputs and reliable inputs and healthy outputs, versus extractive ones, which are primarily focused on sucking wealth up from the grassroots and concentrating it at the top. When you get overly extractive economies, you get boom-bust cycles, and you eventually will get economic collapse. Okay, so there's one other thought that goes along with this, is how do you get out of this? Well, part of it is that you start learning how to create local synergies. How do you rebuild those little small-scale, intricate circuits and keep them so that they stay, they're naturally self-reinforcing, naturally self-sustaining. Okay, so this is an example from Curitiba, Brazil, with their mayor, Jaime Lerner, did some incredibly creative things about connecting unmet needs with underutilized resources. Okay, so I'm a city government, and I've got sanitation problems because there's these favelas up on the hillside, and there's garbage all over the place, and there's health problems, but you have budget constraints, and so you can't afford to just go up there and clean it off all the time. And on the other side of the fence, you have the favela has no jobs, it has poor education, it has very little money, and it has very poor transportation. So the creative way to connect these two things that Lerner did was he instituted a recycling program, so that every time you brought down a bucket full of recyclables, they would give you a bus token. And the bus token then, of course, allowed you to move, take the bus to a job across town. They eventually advanced the program, and they included not just bus tokens, but maybe if you did enough, you got a credit for a local course at the community college. Over time, these kinds of creative connections, where instead of having to rely on money, which is often scarce, you find creative ways to get people who are underutilized, particularly human resources, and connect them up in a way that's going to increase the synergy and the vitality of the overall system in a kind of a natural self-sustaining way. Oop. Time is up, so I'm going to skip the measurement problem and just say there's two takeaways. One is that a rigorous science of vitality is possible, and the other is that we are called to be architects of the future, not its victims. When you get into this understanding of that there are natural patterns and there are optimal ways of doing things that make sense across systems, whether it's a human system or an ecosystem, then you realize that we're not completely casting around and have no idea which way to go. It's that, that nature has provided a plan that's going to get us out of the woods. We just need to learn how to follow it and do it. So I'm also having, up here is my colleague, Brian Fath, who does the really hard science part of this kind of thing. Okay, the window of vitality?
Yeah, please, thanks. Am I on? Can you hear me now? So yeah, thank you everyone for having me. Thank you, Paul and Sally, for sharing a few minutes of your time. I should mention, I'm a professor at Towson University just up the road, so it's nice to be able to come down today for this meeting. I'm a systems ecologist by training and by practice, but I'm broadly interested in issues of interdisciplinary application of these network approaches and holistic ideas. So as Sally mentioned, this is some work from one of our colleagues, Bob Ulanowitz, that has come out of the ecological network analysis methodology. And what's really nice about this is that it does provide this quantitative way of assessing this balance between is a system too redundant or is it too efficient. And so Bob is an ecologist, and he collected data on food webs and how energy is distributed among the parts of a food web. And these can be maybe lumped together in very large functional groups with only 6 or 7 or 8 compartments. Some of them might have 50 or to 100 different compartments if they're down at the species level. But what he found when he first was developing this theory, and then he started plotting the results for the food webs, and they all ended up there at the top of that curve. And that was what was really interesting about this result. So nature, through evolution and through time of just development, was already optimizing this trade-off. So it wasn't that food webs were highly efficient or highly redundant. They were optimizing this trade-off. And so that was the really kind of cool aha moment. And so then we thought, through our interest in things like biomimicry and how we learn from nature to design better human systems, we thought, well, what if we were to do the same analysis on flows through human societies? And so I've been working with some of my colleagues where we've taken, you give me any kind of flow network data and I'd love to run this analysis on there. So for example, global oil trade. So there's about 150 different countries in the global oil trade market, and we can look at that network of oil flow and run this analysis. We actually found that it ended up on the overly redundant side, not on the overly efficient side, as we think markets tend to be. We also looked at global trade commodities in general, not just oil, also on the overly redundant side. So all the human organized systems that we've looked at so far have actually ended up on the left-hand side of that curve, which we have published several papers already, but really haven't been able to explain why that is necessarily. And so this is an ongoing area of research. One of the more recent ones that was just published was a study of a water flow network in China. And it was a small rural community, and it was how water was flowing in that community, and it was also ending up on the redundant side. So in other words, humans aren't being as efficient as nature is, even though we think that we're more efficient in some sense. So in other words, it's an ongoing area of research. I think it's really exciting because it's based on this energy network science, in which case if you have any kind of flow data, energy flow, water flow, material flow, information flow, then we can do this analysis and try to make sense of how the organization of those different systems is arranged. So to be brief, I'll end with that. And thanks,
Great.
Sally.
And Paul, were you going to make some comments?
We can open up for questions.
Okay, no questions.
Any questions?
Thank you very much. My name is John Lamb. I'm with Apt Associates. I've spent 40 years in agriculture. Agriculture wasn't mentioned among your examples, so I'm curious to know whether, in fact, you've made attempts to apply it, and this is the reason why. Over the past 20 or 30 years, we went from a focus on supply chain integration into value chain approaches, all in an attempt to try to stimulate agricultural development. All of them sort of forget that we're talking about an agribusiness system, which includes much more than single chains, much more than single sources, multiple products, multiple presentations, multiple target markets, all kinds of complexity that represent a system. One of the problems with the approaches that are now ensconced in the aid approach to agriculture under Feed the Future, which you may be aware of, is to concentrate, first of all, on small farmers, which may have dangers given what you're saying about imbalance. to concentrate on single commodities, which don't represent the totality of the possible products,
Right.
and actually undercut resilience in the system, and introduces actually all kinds of distortions which fly totally in the face of the metrics that you're implying should be applied to agriculture. So my question is, have you seen or have you been involved in applications of agriculture, and do you think that my presumption, based on what you're saying, of its possible application to next generation approaches based not on value chains, not supply chains, not value chains, but value streams, all within a big system would make sense, and would you be interested in working on that?
Oh, I completely agree with everything you just said, and I love the name value streams. That's nice. Because it's absolutely, what you're saying about the imbalances is exactly right. Because if you have just a very few agro-businesses, I wrote a book a few years ago called The New Science of Sustainability, and I can't remember the exact statistic, but something like 80% of the U.S. Crops were controlled by, what was it, 4 companies or something like that. I mean, it's truly astounding. And the problem being that is, if any of those, it's like with too big to fail banks. If any of them go belly up, we're all in deep trouble. And so absolutely, having the concept of balance and scale appropriateness, yes, absolutely.
So you may have done this, so I apologize. What I'm curious about is, how does what you're saying map onto or relate to what Otto was talking about this morning? He was talking about the 4 different levels of operating. And yeah, and the possibility of generative solutions at bring about these kind of systems at the bottom. So how do you, were you there this morning? Were you
oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you tie the two together a
Certainly.
little bit?
I mean, in fact, we had that conversation at my table right afterwards.
Oh, great.
So this is an understanding how things evolve. So if you look at whether it's the evolution of the nervous system or whether it's the evolution of hierarchy in human systems, when you're very small, you're tightly knit, right? As you get bigger, you need ways to keep the system coherent. So in the case of nervous systems, early multicellulars just a little chemical gradient, and that kept them in sync. They got bigger, they had to invent a nerve cell which carried impulses across a bigger thing. As they got bigger still, they had to invent multiple nerves. As they got bigger still, they had to invent brains, which basically are pattern recognition sitting on top of all of that babble going on. And pretty much an analogous thing happened with the evolution of human society. So we start on, very small foraging pods of early hominids. You get hunting tribes where you have greater social coordination. You get the beginning of language. You get agrarian villages. You get inventions of money and myths and other kinds of things to maintain coherence. You get councils. But by the time you get, I think the numbers usually consider around 350 people, then those mechanisms cease to be sufficient to maintain a cohesive unity. So they start inventing hierarchies. And especially if you're an agrarian village and you're doing really well compared to your more primitive tribal predecessors, those tribal predecessors are going to come in and want to take what you have. So you have to develop a hierarchical defense mechanism, which everybody does. Eventually, those hierarchical defense mechanisms get turned towards empire building. So maybe you have a war with your neighbor, and the first time you just exterminate them and take their land. But then eventually you figure out, oh, it's better not only to take their land, but we'll enslave the people and use them to build more roads and so on and so forth. So there's this natural progression of getting bigger and needing infrastructure to hold things together. So in this view, we've been doing coercive hierarchies or command and control militaristic hierarchies for the last 5,000 years, and that we're now at a cusp of a major transformation in hierarchy. So that, and because I'm a nonlinear dynamics person, I see it as a fractal. So in a fractal, what you have to have, you'll still have to have hierarchical infrastructure for all the same reasons you needed them before. But what we have to do now is change them from essentially empire building, coercive hierarchies into servant hierarchies and guardian hierarchies, the kinds of things that we actually believe they should be but frequently aren't, but occasionally are. So I see the next stage as solving the problem of how to both empower collaborative learning at that lower intricate level and rebuilding the problem-solving ability and capacities that's implicit in the vast array of humanity. So re-energizing that, and then having it integrated with a guardian and coordinative and supportive hierarchical infrastructure. So it's not just a bureaucracy serving the elites. It's actually a whole hierarchy which is empowering each level and appropriately maintaining constraints and facilitations. So that answers your question.
Can I just add one thing quickly to that, is that I think that the sensibilities, I mean, I really like to see the fact that the fourth level is the ecosystem level, and as being an ecosystem ecologist and in that area, so that it's this idea of learning from nature, and it's really kind of come to that now of learning the experiences that we have in there. The piece that's missing that we discussed a lot over lunch was the consciousness piece. So that's a new angle that Otto is bringing into this, and from that side, that we don't know yet really how that merges with the ecosystem, but it's exciting, I guess, to see how that'll work out.
I'm sorry we've come to the end of this discussion because we have to move on to the next, but Sally and Brian are around and we can kind of corner them at the breaks and ask more questions and kind of move on. But thank you, Sally and Brian.